Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you, Nick, and thank you all for your interest. I'm very pleased to present the post-fire flood history with emphasis on debris flows and landslide dam outbreak floods for southern Santa Barbara County. This work was done with Dr. David Rogers out of Missouri Science and Technology. We first got the idea to do this right after the 1/9 debris flows. Questions were raised, how often does this occur? Opinions were offered, but it didn't appear that anybody actually looked back at our history. So I proposed to the partnership, which is now the project, why don't we look into the history and see what we come up with? If there's enough meat there, then let's really dive into it. So I started a pilot study, and the 1914 debris flow event really stood out, and there was a lot of detail. So that prompted me to take on this study and look into it with more depth. Very briefly here, the Montecito Catchments, as shown in the right-hand photos, are very steep. They're underlain by erodible shales and siltstones that weather to mud. The sandstone formations weather to large boulders and are the bullets for the debris flows. These drainages are very steep, they're confined, they have steep slopes, and on the side slopes, there's a number of large bedrock landslides that not only pose a hazard to dam the creek, but they also contribute a large amount of debris. One aspect that's been occurring, obviously everyone's aware of the atmospheric rivers. They approach from the south. If you look at the lower left diagram, as they approach our mountain range, which the ridge line is roughly about 4,400, 4,500 feet in elevations, these storms rise over the crest and they actually drop more rain on the south side of the ridge. So therefore our watersheds get an abundance of rain. You can look at the rainfall amounts of Casa Dorinda or downtown Santa Barbara, compare them to the stations in the watersheds, and the rainfall stations in the watersheds obviously get quite a bit more rainfall. These are the watersheds that we're focused on in Montecito: Cold Springs, Hot Springs, coalesce into Montecito Creek watershed, San Isidro, Buena Vista, Romero, and the smaller watersheds, Oak Creek and Cake Creek. If you note, this area from the canyon mouths are roughly at the foot of the hills. So the mountain portion of the watersheds form about 11.5 square miles, which is a fairly large area. And if you look at the narrow corridor of the river mouths area, it's only about 3/4 of a mile wide. So all this large area that captures the rain, creates runoff, all funnel into a very small area. So that's one of the reasons this lower area, the lower fan area, is susceptible to floods just from that constriction. If we look at the community of Montecito, it's developed on alluvial fans called debris fans. And the reason for that is they're just abundant debris, logs, big boulders that are shed from and discharged from our canyon mouths. You can see these kind of lobe-shaped or tongue-shaped features. Those are the debris fans. And if you look close to the canyon mouths, you can see that they're actually forming some topography here. And the toe of these steeper fans are roughly about here. And these are still steep channeled alluvial fans. And there's just abundant debris. In the lower area here, water wells established that the alluvium, these alluvial fans, are up to 700 feet deep or more. So this deposition of debris charged floods has been occurring for tens of thousands of years. and it actually provides the aquifer for much of Montecito. We have two objectives for the TPRC. Our team is myself, Dr. J. David Rogers, Dr. Ben Willardson, and Hassan Kazray. We asked the question, what is the optimal private-public long-range strategy for the safety of people and the property below the Montecito Canyon mouths? It is, at times, can be a dangerous area, especially after post-fire conditions. And one of our objectives is to identify locations and develop preliminary plans for debris structures along the principal creeks. And we set a high goal to mitigate a 1.9 magnitude event. So that is obviously a lofty goal. That's a long-term goal, and I'll speak a little bit about that more ahead. All of us are aware of the 1.9 debris flows following the Thomas fire. 23 fatalities, over 550 homes destroyed or damaged. Jeremy Lancaster accounted for over $1 billion in economic losses, and Highway 101 closed. And that was a lesson for everyone in terms of debris flows. It seemed like debris flows somewhat got out of people's minds. If you look at the late 1800s, the 1900s, there was more awareness of these debris flows, although they didn't call them debris flows, but they were aware of the flood hazards back then. And I'll mention that here briefly. So as we look back from the 1.9 event, it appears that we haven't learned our lesson in terms of these past events. Living next to the creeks can be, I'm sure a beautiful experience. But once we start experiencing these atmospheric rivers or the watersheds are in post-fire conditions, the hazard certainly increases abruptly. This is Old Spanish Town in 1914. Old Spanish Town was located on the banks of Montecito Creeks, right along Para Grande and below Highway 192. The inventory of flood events was one objective. In terms of our scope, we wanted to account for these flood events that includes just clear water floods, debris flows, debris-laden floods, outbreak floods. And we assigned these floods to post-fire events if they occurred within a 5-year period following a fire. And we can understand the relative magnitude of these events based on damages. In other words, did they just destroy a wooden home, or was it a stone abutment bridge, a stone limit house, concrete bridge abutments? So we can get a relative idea of the magnitude of the boulders, of the logs from the damages. And the most important aspect of this study is the recent past is the key to understanding the near future. I think this is very valuable work in terms of we're looking at a recent past. We also have climate change that's changing our weather patterns and giving us more intense storms, more intense droughts. And so looking at our recent past is very valuable in terms of our history and what's going to occur in the future. So in terms of our knowledge gained, we'll know how many flood events we've occurred, what type of damages and degree of damages, where did they occur. One of the pilot programs or the pilot study I did was, can we reconstruct flow paths? And I think we did a very nice job for the 20th century floods. And we can identify avulsion sites, points in the creek that get blocked, and we create out-of-channel flow paths. Our master plan study, as I mentioned, is a vision for the future and a coordinated long-term strategy. We want to place these debris basins at the canyon mouths or just upstream of the canyon mouths. For example, here's LA County flood control map of their debris basins, and they're all located right along the canyon mouths or just above it. A few of these are actually flood retention basins out here in the alluvial plain. So those have a different purpose. But the debris basins are located at the canyon mouths or just right above it. That way, we capture that dangerous debris and we can remove it from the flow. So a flood or a mud flow out on the alluvial plain is much less dangerous because you don't have the impacts of the big boulders and the logs acting as spears. And so we want to propose a combination of debris basins and nets. These need to be robust so they can withstand destructive impacts of boulders and logs. We want a redundant system, so if one fails, we have another system to capture and keep the community safe downstream. And these also need to be resilient, so over the long term, they're cost effective. And what we propose is a master plan so that we identify the high hazard areas first, and we focus in on those high hazard areas and then work our way to lesser hazard areas, as well as complement what's been done before. So we don't really kind of do a hodgepodge, it's not patchwork, but we approach it from the highest hazards and we work in a complementary system so that we complement what's been done before. As many of you, as all of you are aware, we have a fire history that occurs with wildfires occurring about every 20 to 30 years. NC actually studied the channel basin sediments. This is from the discharge from our creeks out into the ocean, and it creates a varve-like stratigraphy where sometimes it's just sediment, layers of sediment, and then you'll have a whole bunch of organic debris produced from discharge after fire. And he identified 20 large fires in about the last 550 years. And I actually referenced the Santa Barbara Fire Council website. And since the 1950s, we've been averaging one large wildfire about every decade. Once again, just showing our extensive fire history and the steep terrain of our watersheds. Thomas Fire was one of the largest wildfires, and however, larger wildfires have occurred since then. Droughts are getting more intense, and our executive director, Pat McElroy, mentioned that these fires are burning hotter and they're burning longer. I thought this was an interesting photo. 1871, there was a massive fire in Montecito and it burned the Hot Springs Resort, which is shown here. If you look at the top center photograph in 1876, you can still see our slopes 5 years later haven't completely recovered, right? Same thing for 1877 here, 6 years after. We got some vegetation, but they haven't completely recovered. Several years later, you can see the vegetation's much thicker. So it really comes, there's multiple factors here, rainfall, how does it occur? But following the 1871, certainly 6 to 7 years afterwards, these slopes are still susceptible to debris flows. Post-fire watershed conditions. Here's a photo of the upper headwaters of San Ysidro Creek, barren of vegetation, highly riddled from erosion. And wildfire certainly increases the potential for runoff and erosion. It removes the vegetation on these steep slopes, which retards flow off them, so the flow increases velocity. We remove the vegetation canopies, the tall, the short, the ground litter. So the ground is susceptible to rain splash and higher overland flow, which increases erosion. We can create hydrophobic soils, which seals the soils, decreasing infiltration, increasing runoff. There's a process of soil disaggregation that creates dry gravel. And in essence, we increase overland flow. Debris flows can be triggered by high intensity, short or long duration rainfall. Atmospheric river events also can trigger debris flows on saturated ground that are either fully recovered or vegetated watersheds. This happened in 1914, 1969. I'm just going to briefly go through the terms I'm going to use here. Flood is basically a normal, or what we call a quasi-clear water flow, because the flows are always muddy, but it's basically a flood. Debris-laden floods are more dangerous. That's what we experienced on January 9th, 2023, where you can hear the big massive boulders bouncing on the creek bottom, being transported by the high flows. The bed load just gets moved by bouncing along the channel bottom. It creates abundant erosion of the channel banks. It can actually lower channel banks, and in some cases, it'll actually just fill up the channel full of debris, such as in the upper photo in Buena Vista Creek. And once the channel is filled, it's going to take off in another direction. And in the lower photograph, we can see the restored Buena Vista channel. Debris flows are very dangerous. They're fast-moving slurries of mud, rock, massive boulders, logs, trees, shrub. They can move at high velocities, 25 to 35 miles an hour. The snouts, which are the front end of the debris flow, can build up to 10, 15, 20 feet high. These massive boulders only weigh 1/5 of their dry weight in this mud slurry due to buoyancy forces. So a 5-ton boulder really only weighs 1 ton in a debris flow because of the mud viscosity and the mud density. And once these debris flows start destroying material, houses, infrastructure, then it incorporates concrete, wood siding from homes, automobiles, and so they just entrain more and more debris as they make their way down. And they also just eat the channel bottom and incorporate more and more debris. Landslide dam outbreak floods. These were actually well known in the late 1800s and 1900s. Warnings were given out from the watersheds that the creeks were damming. I think they're just not well known in this area as they were, over a century ago. Landslide dams can block drainages. Once they block a drainage, a temporary lake will form it behind it, and they typically will overtop in 12 to 24 hours. And if it's a catastrophic breach, you just release that lake all at once, and these transition into debris flows and debris-laden floods, and you just have a massive flow out the canyon mouth, and they're quite destructive. To go over our findings briefly, we've accounted for 57 flood events in the last 200 years. Of those, 39 were debris flows and debris-laden floods on the south coast. Roughly about 2/3 were post-fire events, 60%. 23 events occurred in the Montecito watershed, and it was roughly about 60%, 2/3 that were post-fire events. And we've accounted for 11 landslide dam outbreak floods. And that was a surprise to me. For Dave Rogers, it was not, but for me, once we started really diving into this, it was a remarkable discovery that we had these outbreak floods. There were 5 notable events. 1825 was the first recorded post-fire debris flow. Richard Henry Dana arrived in 1835, and he noted when he arrived on land, there was no trees in the hills of Santa Barbara. And he came to learn that 12 years earlier in 1823, there was a massive fire on this coast, and it burned. It sounded like a sundowner type driven fire, because it came from the mountains and then came all the way down to the coast, burned to the town, and it was just a massive fire. 1861-62 deluge, where it literally rained for nearly 40 days and 40 nights. it reconfigured the entire landscape of our coast. 1914 debris flow event was an atmospheric river event. 1995 debris-laden floods, again, atmospheric river, and our 19 event, which is post-fire. There are a number of other post-fire events and debris-laden flood events just noted here. I'm not going to go through every one of them, but the main theme, the recurring theme, these were described as 15 to 20-foot high waves of boulders and logs. They didn't call them debris flows until after 1934, the Montrose debris flows, but these were described as tidal waves of boulders and logs. Massive boulders and logs are entrained and deposit debris all the way down to the coast. Once a channel gets plugged, you form a new path, and it could form a new channel 1,000 to 2,500 feet away, nearly a half mile away. And oftentimes we can reoccupy abandoned channels. Oh, wait, too far, I skipped one here. Okay, 1914 event, it was initiated after 2 atmospheric river events. The first event, it rained about 7.5 inches. The second atmospheric river event occurred 2 days prior with about 8.5 inches of rain, and it culminated with 4.5 inches of rain in a 2-hour period. Very intense rainfall. There was some small fires prior to this, but they really had negligible effect because they were very small. So this was a non-fire debris flow event. Boulders and vegetation were braided all the way down to the coast from Gaviota to the Rincon. And this was related back to the 1825 event, where all the trees had been cleared out from the watersheds and the canyons and ended up on the coastal plain. It was noted it was about the similar magnitude, similar catastrophe, although there was much less population in 1825. In 1914, the population was about 25% of what it is today. There were 2 additional debris flow events within a month that also affected Montecito, Carpinteria, Santa Barbara, and a total of 6 fatalities in those 3 events. 1914, same event, we tallied the inventory of damages. We were able to reconstruct flow paths and identify redundant avulsion sites. Numerous outer channel flow paths in Montecito. All the Carpinteria creeks plugged and formed new channel, basically new creeks. And that was a problem for people's property lines. Some people gained property, some people lost property. So they reestablished the creek channels after this, after much litigation too. In Santa Barbara, it was noted that much of the damage was along Mission Creek, 5 bridges wiped out. Huge boulders and trees with trunks up to 3 feet diameter were carried by different creeks. There were numerous landslides described in Mission Canyon that threatened to dam up the floods. In the 3rd debris flow event, it actually referred back to this January 25th event that landslide dams had actually blocked Mission Creek, and they overbreached and it would cause an outbreak flood. 1914 damages, you can see the abundant vegetation in downtown Santa Barbara and in town. This was a stone bridge, a stone lemon house, the Gould. And this is actually on the west side of Olive Mill Road. The Montecito Creek is actually east of this. So this was a breakout channel. Much debris in front of the Biltmore, or what today is the Biltmore at Butterfly Beach. Olive Mill Road had 20-foot deep gullies that were backfilled with debris. A new channel in Old Spanish Town, Montecito, and you can just see the debris jam with this kind of plank wood here from destroyed upstream bridges and buildings. 1964 debris flow event was post-fire event following the COYOTE fire. just abundant logs and boulder debris discharged from our creeks. On the right, this is Highway 192 at San Isidro Creek. You see the log jam. Here's the extent of the fire from the Coyote Fire in 1964. And you note that they recognize this as a flood prone area. And so they were concerned. They started developing debris basins after this point. However, only 2 months afterwards, we had a debris flow. The fire was in September 1964. November 9th and November 10th, with about 2/3 of an inch of rain fell in 20 minutes, initiated the first debris flows. An inch of rain was measured on the 9th, and then just 1/3 of an inch was measured on the following day on the 10th. And we had debris flows on both the 9th and 10th of November. Debris flows were reported from San Isidro westward all the way to San Antonio Creek. We had debris at plugging the bridge crossings deposited on Highway 101. And on San Isidro Creek, the debris flow was described as an avalanche of dry rocks with a huge mass of water and mud behind it. Here's various damages of the debris flows. Most notably in the bottom left, this is a bent gas main that ruptured in the 1/9 event and caused that explosion. And so this had been the site of a prior debris flow and damages to the gas main. And once again, you just get abundant debris filling the creeks. This is not Hot Springs Creek. This is outer channel flows in Riven Rock. This is San Isidro Creek in the upper center and in the upper right. Once again, just massive boulders. This is just upstream of the 192 bridge, and you got to blast them to get them down to a movable size. And the bottom right, this is likely the Glen Oaks, Ennisbrook area along San Isidro Creek, vast amounts of mud. If we look at the 1969 debris flow event, it was very intense rainfall. In the upper watersheds, geez, I mean, we're getting massive amounts of rain at Jameson Reservoir, 6 inches at the Cold Springs debris basin in 12 hours. I consider this to be the 3rd debris flow event following the Coyote Fire. James Stubchair, who was the county flood control deputy engineer, noted that the 1914 flood was more severe than this flood. He also noted that the 1967 debris-laden floods had occurred. He had found very little on it, but there were reports that it was debris-laden floods that affected Santa Barbara. So that would have been the 2nd event following the Coyote Fire. And he also noted that there were numerous landslide and debris dams that formed in the creeks and gave way. And so you just form these landslide dams along it. The debris gets plugged in constricted points in the creeks. And James Stubchair just noted that there was just a progression or domino fall of these dams. Once the upper ones broke, that there was just so much mass and momentum, it broke the downstream one, and they just successively breached. And you just create a much larger outbreak flood as a result. And a newspaper account actually stated that Montecito will not have adequate flood protection until a series of large capacity debris dams can be constructed in the canyons. One point that I forgot to mention regarding the 1964 debris flows, following the November debris flow event, the county actually went and demolished bridges to allow future debris flows to make it past these constriction points. One of those was the 192 bridge on San Isidro Creek, and it took about 2 years to rebuild. So, you know, that was the thinking back then, that you got to let these things pass the constriction point. So now I hope we're beyond that and we can kind of think ahead and start planning for this and really start to design debris basins that can retain substantial amount of debris. Once again, 1969, just ample amount of debris being shed from our watersheds. The debris just acts as these boulder bombs that just completely destroy homes. The logs just act as destructive spears. This was interesting on a lower San Ysidro Creek. There was actually a causeway connecting the two, these two buildings, and it actually gave way because the banks got eaten out or eroded, and then this building over the top of it just failed. And here's an inundation map of the debris flows event. You can see Romero Creek and San Ysidro Creek kind of took the brunt of it, but as well on the other creeks to the west as well. And so it's the debris here that makes blockages on fans at constriction points. For example, here at 192 on San Ysidro Creek, massive boulders. 1971, just massive boulders on Toro Creek. 1914 debris on Mission Creek. And you can divert these flows 1,000 to 2,500 feet away. So what we did is we actually recreated the 1914 debris flow paths shown in the red arrows here. The red polygons indicate where bridges were destroyed. Magenta is where it formed a constriction point. And you can see here's Highway 101. These double black lines represent the Coast Highway, which was the highway prior to 101. And you can see in lower Montecito, on the lower fan, the flows bifurcated into 5 different directions out here. And the easternmost actually flowed out at the eastern property line of the Miramar Resort. However, now with Highway 101, this area acts as a debris basin because it's topographically lower than the surrounding area. So it seemed that once it was converted to 101, this flow path did not occur again. And we can put all the 20th century debris flow paths on a map, and we can see that we get redundant flow paths, for the most part. If you look in these in the arrows here, we have generally the same flow paths, and so they occur generally redundantly. However, that's the thing with debris flows. If it plugs a different location, it can go in a different location it had not gone prior. These show the various channels of Mission Creek since 1869. And you can just see these are just former channels. Some of these still show swales or topographic depressions. And if a flow gets diverted, it can actually capture and actually redivert the flows in a different direction. This is San Ysidro Creek here, right along here. This is Highway 192 right here for a frame of reference. This is the current creek path, channel path. Randall Road Basin would be located here. The pre-1861 San Ysidro Creek actually flowed off here to the southwest. And the date of the 1861, 1862 floods, of which there were many, backfilled this channel and abandoned it and created the new channel out here as we know it today. And following the 19 event, debris flows actually were diverted down this former channel. And if there's ever a significant plug up here and the debris flows divert down El Bosque Road, they could completely miss the Randall Road Basin. So that's one important aspect of building debris basins up at the canyon mouth. You want to capture that debris. Here's our 2018 LiDAR showing the topography of Cold Springs, West Fork, East Fork, Hot Springs. And we're going to kind of circle in this area here of these large landslides. So here's kind of the watershed here for Montecito Creek, Hot Springs, Cold Springs. These two landslides we're going to focus in on. But if you look at this landslide here, it occurs at the confluence of this tributary here, which is quite large, and this significantly large tributary here. If this were to move, this would create a substantial lake behind it. This landslide here, it's located here, this actually failed in 1909, and we believe that this formed a landslide dam in 1914. And I'll zoom in on this area next. And here's our large landslides here. 1909, this was described as a rock avalanche. The headscarp, which is the scar up here, that could be seen from downtown Santa Barbara, 4.5 miles away. This is a significant landslide, but this is the one that I consider a high hazard to the downstream community, because if this were to move substantially, it's going to block this tributary, it's going to block the tributary I pointed out, and that could be a substantial outbreak flood, very significant. And we can see the landslide debris on the side slopes. And this is a very narrow, confined drainage here, so this landslide really doesn't have to move much. Landslides also contribute a significant amount of debris. This is the area we were just looking at on West Fork, Cold Springs, East Fork, Cold Springs. In the lower right, this is landslides that occurred in the upper headwaters of San Isidro Creek. And this is where material has been completely removed, evacuated away. The debris is long gone, but it contributes to the sediment, to the mud, and to the rock debris for debris flows. And if we look just east along kind of to the right here, we can just see that there's basically a weak zone in the geology of the San Isidro headwaters, where we've had a number of landslides that have completely been evacuated away. 1861 outbreak flood. This occurred in Santa Monica Canyon. There was a home that was located, I think, a half mile away from the channel. The outbreak flood occurred several hours after it had stopped raining, and it was a moonlit night. And it was just preceded by a sound of rushing water and inundated the alluvial plain. It wasn't too destructive because it wasn't too populated at that time. In the same year, there were 3 employees of the Hot Springs Resort, and they eyewitnessed just landslides just shedding off the slopes, and described it as acres of timber, rock, and earth shed off slopes. And landslide dam warnings were actually issued for Hot Springs Creek. One of the workers was killed and another seriously injured, and actually got swept away by one of these landslides. 1879 in Carpinteria Creek is a very well-detailed outbreak flood. And this was the first account, a newspaper account, that related post-fire conditions to a higher hazard in the winter because of the stripping of trees and logs from the canyons and discharged onto the plains. This was actually exciting stuff to read. The dam breached within about 12 hours of the initial rain. The total rainfall on the coast was about just under 3 inches. Massive boulders destroyed a ranch home in the eastern tributary of Carpinteria Creek, and a large stone abutment bridge was completely just washed away. 2 fatalities resulted. They actually hiked up the canyon after the event and found evidence of a landslide dam that was 40 feet high. And I think this is about the second landslide dam that was roughly about 40 feet high. 1926 was another well-documented outbreak flood on San Isidro Creek. Supervisor Dedrick owned San Isidro Resort back then, and he just noted very intense rainfall that fell upon a burnt slopes of the San Isidro headwaters, San Isidro Creek headwaters, and it produced a thunderous roar. It shook the ground like a train as it approached. and it was described a 15 to 20 foot high wall of trees and boulders and mud. And this deposited 30-foot long logs on the coast highway. This had not occurred on 19, and it washed automobiles off the coast highway. Coast highway being down here. This is a 1901 topographic map. North is to your right. Here's the mouth of San Ysidro Creek, the coast, and you can just see the outbreak flood just widen as it made its way out to the coast. There were log jams formed above Highway 192 and below it. And they were such tightly snagged logs, they couldn't break it up. So they first started trying to burn them. That didn't work. And then afterwards, they had to use dynamite to break up the log jam. Part of it broke out into the 1861 channel. And so that's just kind of an example of these flows being diverted into old channels as well. And 2 subsequent debris flows occurred in April and just made this jam, basically re-establish this log jam here, and they had to make their way up the creek to break it up and use dynamite once again. The January 9th, 2023 debris-laden flood event. This is the upper net in San Ysidro. It captured a debris flow. We think that initiated from a landslide, and it's still serving its purpose. Kevin Taylor estimated about 500,000 cubic yards of debris retained in the south coast. Tens of feet of creek bank were lost along the creeks of Montecito, and in one location at the confluence of Hot Springs and Cold Springs, they lost 50 feet of creek bank as well. Just quickly here's some estimates of the debris flow volume from 19, over 1 million cubic yards in Montecito, and Jeremy Lancaster believed that over 2 million cubic yards were discharged from Montecito and Carpinteria. So in conclusion, we had a number of debris flow and debris-laden events. About 2/3 were post-fire events. 23 occurred in Montecito. There's ample debris in our watersheds. For example, 1995 debris-laden floods filled Santa Monica Basin twice. It has a retention capacity of about 200,000 cubic yards. So from this, we can identify high hazard areas, and we can identify these redundant constriction points. And from here, we can take this knowledge and start to approach a master plan so that we can capture this debris and make the community of Montecito much safer, especially after post-fire events. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Larry. It's sad to see the history does definitely repeat itself.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
Unfortunately.
Anybody have any questions or comments? Joan? You're muted, Joan.
Yeah, just slow on the draw here. I was curious about the debris nets and how those work as a mitigation measure.
Okay, so the debris nets, especially if they're in the headwaters, they prevent the debris flows from building up, from the snouts from building up. And so if you can capture them up high, you prevent the buildup of that debris flow. And for example, even after they're full, they act as a check dam to where they break up that energy as it cascades over the net. So they're very hopeful, and they complement the debris downstream debris basins, because if you can restrict the buildup of the debris flows up high, it makes the potential for debris flows lower less.
And how long do the nets last, and what do you do when they fill up?
Okay, so that's what TPRC is doing right now. They're going through the permitting process, And what they'll do is they're going to fly up a spider excavator rig. It's a two-phase approach to where they initially just open up the channel. They're going to cast the sediment aside and move some upstream to let the flow reestablish the freeboard underneath the net so animals can cross it. And then later in summer, when the flows are lower, they're going to redistribute that sediment downstream so it nourishes the downstream environment, and they'll reestablish the creek channel as it was prior.
And so I guess that leads, or maybe answers, my next and final question, and that is, you know, these are natural processes. This is how the coastal lands built up over time. And so if we're stopping the debris, but I guess we're trying to get the sediment to flow, just not the big rocks, so that we would continue to nourish the beach. Is that correct?
That is correct. And debris basins, the dams such as the Gubernador, they're taking the approach now where we want to allow steelhead to pass upstream. And we don't want to retain the gravel. We don't want to retain the sediment. We want that to flow past so it nourishes the riparian areas of the creek, nourishes the beach. And so debris basins are being redesigned to allow that passage. And really, we want to just get those boulders and the logs. And so we can now design basins to really focus in on the very coarse, the biggest boulders, the biggest logs, and let that finer gravel cobbles, just let that pass through so it continues to nourish downstream.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Yes, Ray.
Is there any plan to try and capture some of the water that falls and leave it in the hills and then to sink it into the ground? And would that be a useful thing to do?
Well, that's almost like a flood retention basin where you slow up the flow, capture it. I mean, absolutely, in terms of replenishing the groundwater is always a good thing. There's just the room is a factor there in the upper, well, let me just say above the canyon mouths. So designing a debris basin, you want that once you capture debris flow in an ideal situation, when you remove it, you would remove it to another location so that it can dewater because it has a lot of water. If you can allow it to dewater, then you're transporting less water and just the debris itself. And now, in terms of kind of the replenishment of groundwater, once you're out on the fan, these debris flows have a variable infiltration potential. Some debris flows are just so clay, they're acting as a perched horizon. So, you know, in terms of kind of replenishment on the fan is possible, such as, you know, the Grand World Basin, although it's not designed as a replenishment to groundwater, having the water sit there and infiltrate is a good thing for, you know, for the aquifers. But I think it's a little bit more problematic in the watersheds upstream of the canyon mouths.
Great. Renee, you had a question?
I had a comment to make. First, I really appreciate your excellent presentation, Larry. It's been a wonderful historical review of our issues. I've heard occasionally some talk about portable dams, reservoirs that can be used to contain all the excess water. I think from what I understand, we end up getting about 30% of it and 70% runs off into the ocean. And so with our intermittent drought years, I think some countries have been experimenting with portable reservoirs. Is that something that is being looked at?
Well, Well, first of all, thank you for your nice comments. And to answer your question, I think California Fish and Wildlife would have an issue blocking a creek channel. I know that's one of the aspects that makes the nets, at least from my perspective, attractive, because you're not blocking that fish passage. You can also have debris basin dams with fish passages, but in terms of trying to put a barrier up to hold up that water, like much like a flood retention basin where you have a temporary storage of water, I think that would be, from the agency's perspective, problematic. Although I'm doing a little bit of work for the Groundwater Sustainability Agency. I know that would be attractive to that group, but as I, I think the creeks themselves are certainly avenues for infiltration because of the coarse debris, as opposed to when you're outside of them, because then you're on debris flows, and the hydroconductivity, the way water can move is very variable. In some deposits, it can infiltrate, in other deposits, it can't. So it's not like there's a pipe work underneath our, the alluvial fans to significantly replenish the aquifers, but I think you're right in terms of we're losing quite a bit of water to run off into the ocean, where, if somebody were to approach it and look at the constraints, i.e. blocking the channel and somehow creating a retention basin with a permeable bottom, that would certainly be attractive to, Montecito Water District, the Groundwater Sustainability Agency, because it would be allowing recharge of the aquifers. So, there's other techniques that are being used that we're very restricted to and can't use here in Southern California. For example, in Japan, they have debris flow breaks that they can immediately put in the channels. And what that does, it's almost like a framework of either wood or concrete glass, where you create a lattice, and once the debris flows over it, it just allows the water to drop out, which causes the debris flow to freeze. And that would be an option here in post-fire conditions, but that wouldn't be acceptable to Fish and Wildlife. So we wouldn't be able to use it here. So that's the problem with some of these kind of blocking the channel and trying to retain the floodwaters.
I see. Well, maybe Fish and Wildlife needs to consider some other alternative methods for storing and having the overflow of water, not obviously blocking the creek.
Yeah, there would have to be some type of approach. Yeah, absolutely.
A diversion of some sort. Anyway, thanks, Larry.
Good question. The last two comments, Christina and then Victoria.
Yeah, Larry, amazing information and report. Really appreciate the history and all of the work that was done on just the photographs, just everything. It's just amazing. And I just wanted to ask you, have you been in contact at all with Whitney Wilkinson from the county? She's in charge of updating the safety element for the county right now and the multi-jurisdictional hazardous mitigation plan. And it'd be nice if this report could at least just be appended to that report. And I'm wondering whether or not you have plans to do this sort of analysis for the remaining parts of the county, because I think it's just so important for people to have a raised awareness of what the history is of these events.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so I'd be happy to discuss with the county any opportunities to get this data into a safety element. So I'm more than open for that and for discussions. we don't have I don't have the opportunity right now from a funding perspective to expand it westward or eastward into Carpinteria. I do have some funds to continue the Montecito aspects of creating flow paths for San Isidro Creek and Romero Creek and Buena Vista that I will continue to do. But I tried to bring in Santa Barbara as much as I could. Much of the focus was on Montecito, but there was much to be learned for Santa Barbara and Goleta. Certainly, they have the same geologic materials. The terrain is just as steep. There are large landslides back there. So, you know, that would certainly be an opportunity for the kind of over the long term to continue to do so. But immediately, unfortunately, no. But thank you.
Victoria?
Yeah, I know that your interest is in debris flow and it's fascinating, really interesting. But I get asked questions all the time about water collection during these rain events for future use. My household has garbage cans under our roof corners to collect water. And I'm curious about whether this has any place in our prevention planning for water resilience.
No, I think that's a good question. I didn't approach or study the water resilience aspect, but you certainly raise an important problem in terms of, and I think that's what's been noted before is somehow can we retain some of this flood waters or excess waters or divert some of it and retain it and for use either in the surface or in the subsurface to replenish our aquifers. So I didn't approach that or study that, but I think that's certainly an important aspect, especially because we're going to be in a drought again, you know, in the near future. And, you know, certainly myself, our neighbors, you know, I see the barrels and I think it's, you know, it's kind of nice to be able to have that barrel full when the spring and the summertime comes and you're able to water the plants or use your gray water to do so. So I think that the point you raise is very important. Unfortunately, I didn't approach that problem, but thank you.
No, I understand you didn't study it, but it amazes me coming from the Midwest that nobody collects water here and we're in a drought community. So it seems to me that needs to be inserted in policy issues around how we become more fire resilient. And people just don't talk about it. So that's why I wanted to raise it.
Yeah. No, thank you. Yeah, no, that's a good point. You certainly have a good point.
Well, thank you, Larry. Amazing presentation. Like the old photos. It's always nice to see those, even though it's tragic. But thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. Okay. Thanks. I appreciate it. Thank you.
So let's go back to our agent.